Okay, we're finishing the second half of the Tapestry, chapter 4. Continuity? Only God can give that kind of continuity in his pattern and design of weaving threads. I'm way ahead of my story, but I simply have to pause to say that if you think Eliza Jane was any worse off for having 8 children and living on a fruit farm, and that her 7th child, George, was not extremely important as a part of her life's work to raise and to prepare for all that was ahead of him, as well as the other people her life influenced, and if you think Rachel was downtrodden because her brilliance was limited to offering a very thorough education to a small number of children whom she gave a foundation that is rare in this day, then as grandmother would say, you have another think coming. Certainly, there have been things worth fighting for, and limitations that have been unfair for women, but it is not all black and white. If there were women for whom life was hell in those days of many children, there are also women for whom life is hell today in their places of freedom. As they walk in and out of marriages with multiple divorces, and as they face untold disappointments and discouragements in offices and careers of a diversity of kinds. I'm not saying women aren't supposed to have careers. Cousin Marian had a very satisfactory and fulfilling career in her 40 years of outstanding work in Alexandria, Egypt. But the diversity of the career that the artwork of raising children and creating a continuity of family holds forth is something that mustn't be forgotten as we look at the tapestry of history. If gold medals are being handed out or Nobel prizes, then at least in our own understanding we need to shift some of our twisted ideas as to what outstanding achievement consists of, twisted only by some of the monolithic thought of today. It is the understanding of the whole of history that is limited, and the understanding of the whole person that is limited. Little George Hugh Saville used to recoil when other children sang out and sing-song mimic Georgie Porgy Puddin' and Pie, as children have found ways of teasing each other through the ages. When he was 97, Susan Macaulay, our second daughter, made a tape of his... Wait a second. Is Susan Macaulay the one that wrote the stuff about Charlotte Mason?
Right.
Yes, it is.
That's cool.
For the children's sake. Okay, sorry about that. Susan Macaulay, our second daughter, made a tape of his talking about various portions of his life. I have just been listening to this for 4 hours. It is a rather fantastic experience to hear the voice and personality of your father, still there at 97, and now in heaven for over 3 years. He remembered so vividly, almost smacking his lips, the flavors of the Bartlett pears, Seckel pears, Flemish beauty, apples of a great variety, sour cherries, black and white cherries, and all those berries, black raspberries, red raspberries, strawberries, currants. He goes on to say with such strong feeling, I had to pick gooseberries and currants because they couldn't be spoiled. It took years to graduate to the blackberries, then the red raspberries, which were considered the most delicate. He wasn't allowed to take the reins and drive the horses when they went out into the carriage either, as his father or older brothers always preceded him. And when Mother would take me for a long walk to the train to Pittsburgh, people passing us would lean over and say, Oh, you have your mother's eyes. I felt so annoyed. I knew I had my own eyes, and as a 6-year-old, it made me resentful to hear this silly remark. While little Frank Schaeffer was sorting coal and thinking about running off to sea, George Saville was picking berries on the fruit farm and forging ahead in Aunt Rachel's school, not only reading and writing and doing arithmetic, but starting the languages he was to love so much, Latin, Greek, and German. What a difference in their childhoods. German was a language George loved to learn from a cousin of Aunt Rachel's on her mother's side of the house. Nick Roberts was an artist who came to live with the Paydens with his wife for a time and to paint there. Mick Roberts' wife, Grandfather Saville still remembered at 97, taught him the differences between Northern German and Southern German, ich or ish, and so on. Until George was 12 years old, the Savilles lived on the farm. Then John Saville bought a property with 3 other families in the family buying adjoining lots, so that what my father called a family compound came into existence. His older brother, Dr. Dade Saville, with his wife and children, lived on one corner. It was here that he had his offices and became a well-known and respected doctor in Pittsburgh. His sister Bess and her husband, Mr. Dade Wills, a banker who later became president of the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, Ohio, lived on another corner, and Aunt Rachel and Uncle George Payton on another, with the Sevilles on the fourth. What a close family life with onenesses and differences of opinions there was for some years there. By the time he was 16, George went from Aunt Rachel's school to Shadyside Academy, where he was a classmate of Andrew Mellon. Not that that made any difference to his life. As far as we know, they had no more effect on each other in school days than Handel and the Prisoner of Shalon had on effect they studied with in their teenage years. The lack of effect on people with whom we were thrown in history, in the amazing weaving together of threads in totally impossible or unexpected ways, are equally a mystery. We know choice is not all that is involved, and we know that this is not a deterministic universe, nor a fatalistic history. What we are looking at is reality, not a fairy story spun out of a human imagination. If I were spinning a yarn or writing a romantic novel, I could rush ahead here and imagine Andrew Mellon spending half his great earnings in days ahead to further the work of the China Inland Mission, in which George Seville, sitting in the next desk, would one day be involved. But he didn't. That is not what happened. All was not idyllic in that family compound growing up situation for George. There was his eldest sister, Jenny's bad marriage, which gave her some agonizing years of waiting for an alcoholic husband to come home from his wanderings, at which time he would gather up some of her possessions and whatever money he could find and disappear again for indefinite periods of time. One day Jenny asked if she could live with her sister's family, the Wills, on one of the corners of the land, and she became a quiet little person, cooking marvelous food, serving it beautifully, caring for the house, and seeing that all the mending was done. You, Bess, need to be with the children or by your husband's side as he advances in banking. Just let me do this, she would say. And one time she said of her passion for the man she married, it was like a disease that I had caught. I wish someone had locked me up until it was over. A lesser yet puzzling difference in the family's ways of looking at things took place at Christmas time. The doctor's wife, who was Episcopalian, loved to have a gorgeous big Christmas tree with piles of presents under it, arranging that it would suddenly appear on the morning of the 25th of December, having been brought by Father Christmas during the night. Not one hint of trimmings, pine, gift wrappings, or tinsel could be found anywhere ahead of time. It all happened sometime between midnight and early morning. But just across the lawn on the other corner, strict Scotch United Presbyterian grandparents frowned on Christmas trees, no matter who prepared them, and on piles of gifts or any other heathenish decorations. At their breakfast table on the 25th of December, modest little piles of gifts, clearly marked with the names of the givers, were placed beside the plates of oatmeal. Just what the official explanations were, I've never been sure, but many were the lively discussions among the cousins, young aunts and uncles, and their nieces and nephews as to these and other differences among them. By the way, in case you're wondering, the Christmas tree and all the decorations disappeared, leaving no traces sometime in the middle of the night between New Year's Eve and New Year's morning. When Father, at 97, talked with Susan, his warmest memories of Shadyside Academy were his times of reading Greek with Professor Crabbe, the headmaster. He and I read 3 books of Anathemas. Is that how you say that? Anathemas? Anathema? I don't know. Together. And it was a great experience, really putting me ahead of the others in Westminster College when I got there. I remember there were 2 girls doing Greek at that time in college, and since they were congenial to me, we read Greek together every day. I guess they were more than congenial, as my father broke the rules and went buggy riding with the girls, for which he was called up on the carpet and warned, "Once more and you will be expelled." His big brown eyes and thick curly dark hair must have done more than protect his head from accidents playing football. He was a quarterback on the team. Small and wiry, a good player, he shone in that position. He excelled also in tennis, his other good sport. When boys began to grow their hair long in recent years, he said, "Why, the very idea. They have no reason. You see, we grew our hair long because we needed more hair to protect our heads for football, since we wore no helmets." He went to Westminster College, New Wilmington, Wilmington, Pennsylvania from 1895 to 1898, earning an A.B. with high honors. Sports and studying were not all that filled his time, as he played a guitar and was in a quartet, and with a sense of humor and skill at mimicking, he was often called on for skits, often with his own jingles or rhymes about such current subject. For 2 years after college, Father taught Latin and Greek in a boys' prep school. Then, having heard of the China Inland Mission and the need of China for more people to be willing to make the gospel known, he began to find out all he could about Hudson Taylor's work. Past history and present need. He prayed, then felt that the next step God was leading him to make was to prepare with a theological education. Thus, it was that he entered the Allegheny Theological Seminary of the United Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh to study for the years 1900, 1901, and 1902. Now he was studying Hebrew as well as Biblical Greek and all the other subjects. His averages for each of the 3 years are here before me on his report: 97 and 1/8, 97 and 19/22, 98 and 2/15. I'm not sure how they got all those fine fractions, but it was an impressive record. George Hugh Saville, 5 foot 3 inches in those days. He got shorter in his old age before he reached 101. With his curly black hair, mustache, and twinkling dark eyes, must have made quite a picture setting off by steamship, the Maru, a Japanese boat from Vancouver about November 3rd, 1902, with blonde, blue-eyed Will Hannah about 6 feet 1 inch. Father had left Pittsburgh by train on October 28th, so I've given him long enough to get out there at the train speed of those days, and perhaps romantically have dated his sailing on my birthday. No one knew there would be a special November 3rd to come. How can anyone be blasé about his or her existence? How much faith it takes to believe in chance. Father was setting sail. Oh, yes, I know it was a trembling, sooty steamship, noisy, not gliding out on sails, but the expression is beautiful. Into the beauty of a sunlit sea, expecting all kinds of sacrifices, but not knowing that in China there was to be starting another set of lines on the family tree, and not thinking about the tapestry and wondering where his thread would be woven in. At least I don't think that was in his mind. Father laughed with his funny chuckle as he told, at 97, of how seasick Will Hannah was. You see, I didn't get seasick, and I think it was because I stayed up on deck all day, while Will wouldn't get out of his bunk. Why, the very idea that was foolish. You see, I walked and I enjoyed the wind and waves. When we were at the Aleutian Islands, west of Alaska, there was a snowstorm with a good thickness of snow, which stayed on the deck. Had a great time throwing snowballs. I'm sure that's why I never got seasick. You need to stay in the open air. When the ship got to Japan, they stayed a week and looked around before going on to Shanghai. Arriving on December 2nd, 1900, Father received his introduction to the mission home of the China Inland Mission at the end of his first ride in a rickshaw pulled by a coolie. The first man he met in the compound of the China Inland Mission was Guinness of Honan. This came as quite an amazing circumstance to me, since later on in my own life, not only was I to be a dressmaker for a time for Geraldine Guinness Taylor, but Oz Guinness would someday be a Labrie worker. I didn't know that connection. Did you?
That's neat.
I must, however, pull the magnifying glass back to 1900. After the proper time of language study, the time came for both Father and Will Hannah to be assigned to their stations. This is where the seasickness came in. One assignment was to be far inland, in the Switzerland of China, a journey by ox cart. The other assignment was to be in Wenchao, Cheking Province, entailing a boat trip down the coast and then up a river into the city of Wenchao. Will Hannah never wanted another boat ride, not if he could help it, which affected the choice of assignment, mercy being shown. Had the assignment been switched, there never would have been a Janet, an Elsa, a John Eldridge, or an Edith Rachel Seville. So you might say seasickness had something to do with my existence, if you were looking for a line for a play. Down a river on a Chinese riverboat sailed Father, watching with interest as his meals were cooked on deck, over coals, and getting his first glimpse of Ningpo as they stopped there. The journey continued out to sea around the coast and up the Wenchao River to Wenchao itself. Father had a pigtail by this time, as this was a requirement that Hudson Taylor made for his missionary men. If a man could not grow his own, then one could be fastened to his round black silk pillbox hat, but a pigtail he must have, or cute, as it was called. Hudson Taylor felt it was imperative for missionaries to dress exactly like the people among whom they were working, so that they would not look or seem strange. My father scorned tacking a Q onto his hat, so began to grow one as rapidly as possible. He had his head shaved in a circle around the crown, so that what was growing came from an inner circle covering the top of his head. The black silk pillbox hat had a hole in it, out of which the well-braided queue was to hang. Around the outside of the pillbox, the head was to be shiny and hairless, giving a neat appearance by these standards. Father's curly black hair grew rapidly and braided into a very fine, thick queue indeed, one he was proud of, and all his own. Wearing a mandarin gown of brocaded silk with sleeves that were not only wide but longer than his arms to properly hide his hands, the proper kind of trousers that peeped out the button of the gown, and handmade cloth shoes, Father looked very Chinese. In time, his manner of using his hands, along with his good pronunciation of Chinese, made him fit in well. It is said that often the Chinese who did not know who he was, thinking he really must be Chinese, would say of him, "Look at that Chinese, he looks like a Westerner." That's funny. Boy meets girl. The boy, in this case, now 28 years old, looks quite Chinese as he reaches his station of work after such a long preparation. The girl he meets is a young widow of 30 years old, who has been in China far longer than he, having arrived in 1899. Jessie Maud Merritt Green was also dressed in Chinese fashion, wearing the customary women's trousers under a side-buttoned tunic with its high mandarin collar. She was trying hard to look Chinese, but with her light auburn hair and blue eyes, she didn't succeed very well. But the girl had no interest in this. George, in spite of his extensive repertoire for making himself noticed. In any case, she had long ago resolved that she was never going to marry again, and that her life in China was to be that of a single missionary with a single purpose. George plunged into his assigned work, teaching and preaching in good Chinese, and learning the Wenchaoese, as well as the Mandarin he already knew. And in his time off, he played tennis, not only better than his opponents, but he did it while cutting up, performing antics such as judging when the ball would arrive where he was, then jumping up and twirling one full turn before he hit it, winning the game nonetheless. He also wrote skits and took off Shakespeare with such adaptations as "To shave or not to shave, that is a question," accompanied by appropriate actions. Since George could play the piano as well as the guitar, his takeoffs included musical ones like imitating Paderewski, or an outstanding orchestral conductor directing Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. Charlie Chaplin was becoming well known at that time, and as Father had a small mustache and looked a lot like the comedian, the missionaries named him Charlie Chaplin. Clown is a good term to describe him, at least one part of him. A sense of humor was one of his basic characteristics, yet Father was a person who all his life hated any kind of impudent or facetious reference to the Bible, or of anything related to Christianity or marriage. The things he felt were a part of God's law, not to be made fun of or treated as a joke. Father's acts as a comedian had amazing scope and diversity. His was a special talent, but with all his skit writing and his clowning, he never found a need to use anything he would call questionable. This self-imposed standard simply made him use his imagination in a most versatile way. Jessie Green may have laughed with the others, but she remained cool. Of course, with the mission rules at that time, there wasn't much opportunity for face-to-face communication among unmarried people of opposite sex. They were rarely left alone together, as it was thought that this would be misinterpreted in the China of that day. When they went out for a walk, a married man would walk with my father yards ahead of my mother and the other man's wife. An occasional remark could be tossed over the shoulder, but as you can imagine, it wasn't exactly conducive to, quote, getting to know one another. 50 paces, or about 15 meters, was the accepted distance to give the proper appearance in public places of the modest behavior of men and women. Naturally, the Westerners were under observation, and the rules were made by those who felt this was the only way to let it be known that proper behavior was being observed and Chinese sensibilities considered. George Hughes Seville was falling madly in love with Jessie Maud, and he was using every bit of his imaginative mind to make this known to her without upsetting the proprieties of the Chinese or the rules of the mission board. I came across a diary of his written on his tiny handwriting with a fine pen at just this period of his life. He was pleading with the Lord to show him how to make Jessie love him. The diary entry also stated that he was going to write and ask his brother Dade, the doctor in Pittsburgh, to select a diamond ring and have it sent to him so that it would be ready in case she says yes. You'll have to wait until you have had the background of how Jessie Maud Merritt came to be in the world, where her genes came from, what amazing impossibilities might have prevented her being, and read the story of how she got to China in the first place, to be where she was before it was time to tell you what tactics George thought up to make a proposal possible. The end of chapter 4.
That is so good. Thanks, Mama.
Uh-huh.